What if I told you that the quiet battles you fight every day are not really with people, situations, or fate, but with the impulses that rise inside you before you even notice them? That the sharp word that escapes your mouth, the rush of anger in your chest, the fear that tightens your stomach, all feel like reactions to the world, yet are born in the private space of your own judgment. Because the world merely presents impressions, and it is the mind that decides whether those impressions become suffering or strength. And this truth is not new or fashionable but ancient, tested in war, exile, illness, and loss by men who understood power far more deeply than domination. Men like Marcus Aurelius, writing to himself at dawn before facing an empire, reminding his own soul that nothing external has authority over it unless permission is given, and that reminder alone should make you pause, because in a time where speed is worshipped and instant response is confused with confidence, the rare ability to hold still for a moment has become a form of dominance. Not over others, but over yourself. And that is where real control begins, because the instant you do not react, you reclaim space, and in that space reason wakes up, breathing slows, perspective returns, and suddenly the fire that felt uncontrollable reveals itself as something that can be observed, delayed, softened, and redirected. And Seneca understood this when he warned that anger is never solved by speed, only multiplied by it, because delay does not weaken action, it refines it. And those few seconds you steal back from impulse can save years of regret, broken trust, and irreversible damage, yet most people never take those seconds because they believe silence is surrender, when in truth it is preparation. And preparation is the mark of the strong. And once you learn to pause, you begin to see something unsettling and liberating at the same time, that every reaction you have is a message, a mirror held up to your inner condition. Because when an insult wounds you deeply, it is not the sound of the words that cut, but the meaning you attach to them. And Epictetus was ruthless about this, insisting that it is never the event that disturbs us, but the judgment we make about it, which means that anger exposes pride, fear exposes doubt in your own capacity, and restlessness exposes an attachment to comfort that has not been questioned. And instead of running from these reactions or blaming the world for provoking them, the Stoic turns inward and studies them with almost surgical calm, asking not who offended me, but why did I give this moment the power to rule my mind? Because the moment you take responsibility for your reaction, you take back your freedom. And responsibility is not a burden here, it is relief, since it means the solution is no longer outside your control. And once you see reactions as teachers rather than enemies, life stops feeling like a constant attack and starts feeling like training. Every delay becomes a lesson in patience. Every insult becomes feedback on the strength of your ego. Every disappointment reveals where your expectations were poorly placed. And from this awareness, something stronger begins to form. A kind of inner stability that does not depend on praise, comfort, or control, because those things are temporary and fragile, and building peace on them is like building a house on sand. Which is why the Stoics rejected the idea that peace must be found by escaping the world, because escape only works until the next disruption. And instead, they taught the construction of an inner refuge, a place within the mind where order remains, even when circumstances collapse. And Marcus Aurelius described this as a retreat always available, not in mountains or oceans, but in disciplined thought. Because when you guard what you allow into your attention, when you reduce unnecessary desire, when you train yourself to meet difficulty with courage instead of panic, you slowly erect walls that noise cannot penetrate. And this does not make you cold or detached. It makes you steady, because steadiness is what allows compassion without collapse and strength without cruelty. And when someone lashes out at you, Their words either crash through your peace or fall harmlessly at your feet, depending on what you built your calm upon. And if it rests on reputation or approval, it will shatter. But if it rests on principles and self-mastery, it will endure, because no one can steal what you do not place in their hands. And this is where emotional mastery deepens further, because the Stoic does not aim to destroy emotion, only to guide it. Understanding that emotions are energy, and energy does not need to be suppressed. It needs direction. And just as water gains power by flowing rather than resisting, emotions become useful when they are redirected instead of denied, because anger carries force that can either burn bridges or fuel discipline. Fear can either paralyze or sharpen preparation, and sorrow can either hollow you out or deepen your empathy. And the difference is not the emotion itself, but what you do with it. Which is why naming what you feel matters, because clarity weakens chaos. And once you recognize the sensation in your body, the heat, the tension, the weight, you can choose where that energy goes, instead of letting it choose for you. And this choice is what separates the reactive from the powerful, because reacting is automatic and choosing is deliberate. And Marcus Aurelius captured this perfectly when he reminded himself that refusing to mirror the behavior of those who wrong you is not passivity, but superiority, because you are no longer dancing to their rhythm. And over time, this practice transforms how you experience hardship itself, because adversity no longer appears as a curse, but as a forge. And this may sound harsh until you realize that everything strong is forged, not gifted. And the Stoics never promised comfort, only resilience, knowing that life will break plans, take people, and humble ambition without apology. Yet within that certainty, they found hope, because what breaks also shapes, and what wounds can instruct. And Marcus Aurelius wrote that the obstacle is not separate from the path, but becomes the path itself. Meaning that every setback carries within it the raw material for growth, if you are willing to use it. And this is the quiet power of rising stronger instead of simply surviving, because survival alone keeps you tethered to fear, while growth frees you from it. And acceptance plays a crucial role here, not the kind that gives up, but the kind that stops arguing with reality. Because energy wasted on denial cannot be used for rebuilding. And once reality is accepted, meaning can be extracted. And once meaning is found, pain loses its ability to dominate, because it now serves a purpose. And purpose transforms suffering into fuel. And rebuilding then becomes an act of intention rather than desperation, where you do not return to who you were before the fall, but emerge refined by it. And this does not erase grief or hardship, because the Stoics never denied sorrow. They simply refused to let it define them, choosing instead to carry it with dignity and convert it into wisdom. And when all of this comes together, the pause, the self-examination, the inner refuge, the redirection of emotion, and the willingness to rise again, a pattern forms, a way of moving through the world that appears calm from the outside, but is forged through constant inner discipline. And this discipline does not make life smaller. It makes you larger than life's chaos. Because reacting less does not mean caring less. It means caring with precision, choosing responses rather than surrendering them. And in a world addicted to outrage and impulse, this ability is rare, valuable, and quietly intimidating, because nothing unsettles manipulation more than someone who cannot be provoked. And as this mastery deepens, something subtle but profound begins to happen inside you, because you start to notice that the world itself does not change. People are still careless, circumstances still turn against you, delays still arrive unannounced, yet your experience of all of it transforms, as if the volume has been lowered on chaos while clarity grows sharper. And this is because the mind, once trained, no longer treats every stimulus as a command, but as an invitation to choose. And choice is where dignity lives, because dignity is not loud, it does not announce itself, It is felt in the quiet confidence of someone who does not need to explain their restraint. And this is why the Stoics placed such emphasis on daily inner discipline, not as a rigid ritual, but as a way of keeping the soul aligned, since neglect of the mind allows small irritations to accumulate until they explode, while attention dissolves them before they take root. And this attention begins with awareness of thought itself, noticing how quickly the mind jumps to conclusions, how eagerly it paints intentions onto others, how often it predicts disaster before evidence appears. And each time you catch this habit, you interrupt a chain reaction that would otherwise end in regret. Because thought leads to emotion, and emotion leads to action. And by stepping in at the level of thought, you prevent the collapse before it begins, which is why Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that it is possible to live well right now, not after circumstances improve, not after people behave better, but now in this breath, in this response, and this realization strips away excuses. Because if peace is possible now, then delay is a choice. And once you accept that, you begin to see how often suffering is prolonged by resistance rather than necessity. Because pain is unavoidable, but additional anguish is optional, added by rumination, replay, and imagined futures that never arrive. And Seneca warned that we suffer more in imagination than in reality, which means that the mind, left unchecked, becomes its own tyrant, inventing threats and insults long after the moment has passed. But the trained mind does not cling to these echoes. It lets them fade, returning again and again to what is present and controllable. And this return is not escapism. It is grounding, because power lives in the present, not in rehearsed arguments or remembered slights. And when you anchor yourself here, responses become simpler, cleaner, and more effective, because they are no longer tangled in emotion, and this simplicity often appears intimidating to those who thrive on reaction, because they expect resistance, justification, or collapse. And when none comes, their influence evaporates. And this is one of the quiet victories of emotional discipline, that it starves manipulation without confrontation, and confrontation without hatred, allowing you to act decisively without poisoning yourself in the process. And over time, this way of being reshapes your identity, because you no longer see yourself as someone at the mercy of moods, but as someone capable of bearing pressure without distortion. And this capacity builds trust, both within yourself and from others, because people sense stability even when they cannot name it. And stability attracts responsibility, leadership, and respect, not because you demand it, but because you embody it. And this embodiment is forged most clearly during moments of adversity, when old habits would have reached for blame or despair. Yet now you pause, assess, and move forward deliberately, extracting lessons instead of wounds. And this does not make you immune to hardship. It makes you resilient to its effects, because resilience is not the absence of pain, but the refusal to be defined by it. And every time you endure without bitterness, every time you adapt without resentment, you reinforce an inner narrative of capability, replacing helplessness with agency. And this narrative becomes a shield, because future challenges no longer appear as threats to your identity, but as tests of skills you already trust yourself to possess. And this trust is what allows calm to persist even when outcomes are uncertain, because certainty was never the source of peace. Character was, and character is built through repeated choices to respond with intention rather than impulse. And as these choices accumulate, you realize that emotional control is not about suppression or detachment, but about alignment, aligning reaction with values, action with reason, and effort with what truly matters. And once aligned, life feels less chaotic, not because it is easier, but because you are no longer scattered. And this centeredness becomes your advantage in a world addicted to distraction, because while others are pulled in every direction by outrage, fear, and desire, you move steadily, conserving energy, choosing battles and investing attention where it yields growth rather than exhaustion. And this is perhaps the most overlooked benefit of Stoic discipline. And as you continue to practice this way of living, you stop measuring success by comfort or approval and start measuring it by consistency of character, by how often you meet challenge with clarity, and by how rarely you surrender your peace to forces outside your control. And this shift changes everything, because peace is no longer a reward you wait for at the end of struggle. It becomes the manner in which you struggle, and once that happens, no situation is wasted, no difficulty is meaningless, and no provocation has absolute power over you. Because you have learned slowly and deliberately to stand between stimulus and response, and in that space, to choose who you will be.